Some stories don't make it into the newspapers, not because there is no proof, but because the proof itself raises questions that nobody wants to face. This is one of those stories. In the fall of 1875, a family of 5 disappeared from their farmhouse in the Virginia countryside. The doors were locked from the inside. All of their things were left untouched. There were no signs of a fight, and no bodies were ever found. The only clue was a basement door that had been nailed shut for many years, now standing wide open. What the neighbors discovered inside that basement was never officially written down, but the whispers spread like a fast-moving fire through 3 counties, and what people said they found down those stairs contradicted everything the family had appeared to be for 20 years. This is the recorded story of the Harlow family and the door they should have left shut. The Harlow farmhouse was located 3 miles outside the town of Millbrook, Virginia, on a dirt road that the locals called Kettle Road, for reasons no one could quite recall. Some said it was named for a seller named Kettle who had frozen to death on that road during the difficult winter of 1803. Others believed it was because of the shape of a dip in the road that filled with water after a lot of rain, creating a pool that looked like a kettle. The real reason had been forgotten over time, like many truths in that area of Virginia. It was a simple 2-story house with white wood siding that had turned gray over the years, its paint coming off in long pieces that curled away from the wood like dry skin. The house had been constructed in 1842 by a tobacco grower named Elias Montgomery, who had lost it because of debt in 1854. It was empty for almost a year before Thomas Harlow came with his family in the spring of 1855. The house was in the middle of 40 acres of tobacco fields that went on toward a line of oak and hickory trees that showed the eastern edge of the property. To the west, the ground sloped down to Copper Creek, a small stream that was not deep for most of the year but could rise to dangerous heights during floods in the spring. The closest neighbors were the Porter family, whose land connected with the Harlow's land to the north, and the Cunningham farm, which was nearly 2 miles south along Kettle Road. Thomas Harlow, who was 47 years old when he bought the property, came to Millbrook with a story that answered most people's questions. He said he was born in Maryland and had been a clerk in Baltimore before he got money from a dead uncle. It was enough money to buy a small farm and begin a new life away from the city. His wife, Margaret, came from a well-respected family in Richmond, but she didn't talk much about her past. They had 3 children, Catherine, who was 7 years old in 1855, James, who was 4, and baby Robert, who was barely a year old. The family did not interact much with others, which was not strange for farming families in that area. The years after the war would be hard for everyone. But even in 1855, there was a feeling that Virginia was moving toward something grim and unknown. People were concentrated on their own survival and did not ask too many questions about their neighbors' lives. But there were things about the Harlow home that appeared strange right from the start. When Thomas bought the property, he started making repairs right away. He hired 3 men from Millbrook to help him fix the roof and make the foundation stronger. But after 2 weeks he let them go and did the rest of the work by himself. One of those men, a woodworker named Henry Sutton, later mentioned to his wife that Thomas had been especially interested in the basement. He wanted it dug out deeper, Sutton remembered. He said something about needing a good place to store root vegetables and canned goods. But the way he measured it, the way he demanded certain sizes, it looked like he was making something different, something he didn't want us to find out about. Sutton also recalled that Thomas had purchased a very large quantity of wood, much more than was needed for basic repairs. Enough wood to make support beams for something large, he had said. I asked him what he intended to store down there that would require such strong support. He just smiled and said, "Supplies for the future, Mr. Sutton. A man must always get ready for the future." The first time anyone who was not in the family saw the sealed basement door was in the winter of 1858, 3 years after the Harrows had moved onto the property. Margaret Harlowe's sister, Patricia Downing, came from Richmond for a visit during the Christmas holiday. She got there on December 18th on the afternoon stagecoach with a small trunk full of presents for her niece and nephews. Thomas picked her up at the Millbrook station with his wagon, and they traveled the 3 miles to the farmhouse as it was getting dark. Patricia later mentioned to her husband that she was surprised by how silent Thomas was on the ride. He had given short, unfocused answers to her questions about the farm and the children. His hands were tense on the reins, and his jaw was tight. When she asked if he was okay, he had just said, "We have a quiet life out here, Patricia. Sometimes the silence can feel heavy." The farmhouse, when they got there, looked like it was in good condition from the outside. The fields were not growing for the winter, but the barn looked good, and smoke was coming from the chimney. But when Patricia got out of the wagon, she saw something that made her stop. The windows on the first floor were covered with thick curtains, even though it was not completely dark yet. And from inside the house, she could hear a noise that didn't seem right. A repeating thumping, like a heavy object being dragged across a floor. Margaret greeted her at the door with hugs and happy tears. The children, Catherine, now 10, James, 7, and Robert, 4, were polite but quiet. They stood in a line to greet their aunt with a kind of stiff politeness, as if they had practiced it. Patricia was with the family for 3 days, and those 3 days would stay with her for the rest of her life. The house itself was pleasant enough. Margaret kept it neat and tidy. The food was plain, but there was enough of it. The children were well-mannered, maybe too well-mannered. They only spoke when someone spoke to them, ate their meals without making a fuss, and went to bed at exactly 8 calm every night without any complaint. But there were strange things that Patricia could not overlook. On her first evening, while Margaret was showing her the kitchen and telling her where things were, Patricia saw the door. It was on the western wall of the kitchen, a thick oak door with black iron hinges, but the door had been sealed shut with 8 heavy wooden boards nailed across it in the shape of an X. The nails were big, the type used for building heavy things, and they had been hammered deep into the doorframe with great force. "What is down there?" Patricia asked, gesturing to the sealed door. Margaret's face lost its color. She wiped her hands on her apron, a nervous movement Patricia had never seen her sister do. "Storage," she said, "just a cellar for roots, but it's not safe. It has structural issues. Thomas sealed it up for safety. Couldn't he fix it? A root cellar would surely be helpful. We do fine without it." Margaret's voice had become emotionless. "Don't ask about it again, Patricia. Please." The way she said that last word, please, was filled with such heavy desperation that Patricia immediately stopped asking. But she couldn't stop looking at that sealed door during her visit, thinking about what could possibly need such a drastic solution. On her second night, Patricia woke up at 2 in the morning to use the chamber pot. As she sat in the dark of her room, she heard noises from downstairs. The house was old, and noises moved easily through the floors. At first, she thought it was just the usual sounds of the house shifting in the cold, but then she heard voices, not from the Harlowe family's bedrooms upstairs. These voices were coming from below, from under the house, from the area of the sealed door. She could not hear the words, but she could hear the rhythm of a conversation. A man's voice, low and consistent, and then other voices answering, at least 2 different ones, maybe more. Some of it had a musical sound, like humming or chanting. Patricia sat completely still in the dark, her heart beating fast. She considered going downstairs to see what was happening, but a feeling stopped her. An instinct told her that whatever was going on under the house was something she did not want to find out about, something that was risky to see. She heard footsteps in the hall outside her room, heavy, male footsteps. Thomas was walking toward the stairs. She heard him go down, heard the quiet sound of wood sliding against wood, and heard a door open and close. The voices from below got a little louder for a moment, more clear, and then were quieted again as the door shut. Patricia did not sleep for the rest of the night. She lay in her bed, looking at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house. At one point she thought she heard crying, a woman's voice sobbing quietly, but it could have been the wind. She told herself it was the wind. On her third morning, Patricia was helping Margaret make breakfast when she saw something on the kitchen floor near the sealed door, dark marks in the wood. They were old marks that had been scrubbed many times, but you could still see them if you looked closely. "Margaret," she said quietly, "what happened here?" Her sister did not look up from the eggs she was cooking. "Accidents happen on a farm, Patricia. You know that." "What kind of accidents?" "The kind we don't talk about." That afternoon, Patricia was in the living room with Catherine, showing her how to do a new embroidery stitch. The young girl suddenly asked, "Aunt Patricia, do you ever hear voices that aren't actually there?" Patricia's needle froze in the middle of a stitch. "What do you mean, my dear?" Catherine kept looking at her work. "Sometimes I hear people talking, but when I look, no one is there. Mama says it's just my imagination. She says I'm inventing stories." "Where do you hear these voices?" "At night, mostly. They come from the kitchen, from the place we are not allowed to talk about." Catherine's voice became a whisper. "Sometimes I have dreams that the door opens and people come out. People I have never seen before. They look at me, and they seem sad, so very sad. And in my dreams, they ask me to help them, but I don't know how." Margaret showed up in the doorway so fast that Patricia was startled. "Catherine, go upstairs and see how your brothers are doing." The girl got up right away, putting her embroidery down without any argument. She left the room with her head bowed, not looking at her mother. When Catherine was gone, Margaret sat down with a heavy sigh in the chair her daughter had just left. She looked at Patricia with a look of such deep tiredness that it made her seem 10 years older. "You cannot say anything," Margaret said. "Do you understand? You cannot tell anyone what you have heard or seen in this house." "Margaret, what is happening? What is on the other side of that door?" "I can't tell you. And you don't want to know. Believe me, Patricia, you don't want to know. Just leave tomorrow like you planned. Go back to Richmond, live your life, and try to forget you were ever in this place." "How can I forget? How can I leave you here with whatever this is?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Because there is no other option. Because what has been done cannot be undone. Because if the truth were revealed, it wouldn't rescue anyone. It would only ruin what is left of us. The children, Patricia, think about the children. They are innocent in all of this." Patricia wanted to ask more questions, to demand to know what was going on, but the look of broken desperation on her sister's face made her stop. She reached out and held Margaret's hand, and found it was as cold as ice, even though the room was warm. "Are you safe?" Patricia asked. "Are the children safe?" "As safe as we can be," Margaret answered. "As safe as anyone is in this world. But Patricia, promise me something. Promise me that if something happens to us, if we go missing, you will tell someone. Tell the authorities. Make sure someone knows to check the basement. Why would you go missing?" Margaret did not reply. She just squeezed Patricia's hand one time, hard, and then got up and left the room. Patricia left the next morning. Thomas drove her back to the station in Millbrook without saying a word. As she was getting on the stagecoach, she turned to him and said, "Thomas, whatever you are doing out there, it is not worth it. Nothing is worth the look I see in my sister's eyes." Thomas stared at her for a long time. Then he said, "You are right, Patricia. It is not worth it, but it is too late to go back now. Some paths only move forward. You cannot go back even if you realize you have chosen the wrong way." Those were the last words Patricia Downing ever heard from her brother-in-law. She wrote to Margaret often in the following years, but her letters were frequently not answered. The few replies she got were short and carefully written, not saying anything important. Patricia never went to the farmhouse again, but she remembered her sister's request. If something were to happen to the Harlows, she would tell someone to look in the basement. In 1875, when she heard the news of the family's disappearance in Richmond, Patricia was 63 years old and was sick with an illness that would take her life within a year. She was not strong enough to go to Millbrook herself, but she wrote a long letter to the county sheriff, telling him everything she had seen and heard during her visit 17 years before. That letter got there 3 days after Sheriff Curtis had already found the basement and its secrets. But what Patricia wrote confirmed a very important thing. Whatever had been happening in the Harlow basement had been going on since at least 1855, maybe from the moment the family started living on Kettle Road. 20 years of terrible things hidden behind 8 nailed boards of oak. 20 years of people living under the feet of a family that seemed normal. 20 years of noises that should have made people ask questions but did not. Because in Virginia in those days, there were many things people decided not to see. The 15 years between the time the Harlows arrived and the start of the 1870s went by in a way that seemed deceptively normal to anyone watching from the outside. Thomas worked his 40 acres of tobacco with persistent effort. Margaret took care of the house. The children grew from being young into teenagers. But beneath that appearance of normality, a dark pattern had been set, a way of life that the Harlow family followed with exact care. They went to the Millbrook Methodist Church, but not very often, maybe once every 6 to 8 weeks. They attended so unpredictably that Reverend Walsh could not rely on them for any regular church activities, but often enough that they were still considered part of the community. When they did come, they always got there late and sat in the last row of seats. Margaret would keep the children near her, with her hands on their shoulders in a way that seemed overly firm. Thomas would look straight ahead during the sermons, with a look that was hard to read. They never stayed for the social time after the services. They never went to church picnics or fundraisers. They never asked other families to their house or accepted invitations to other people's homes. Reverend Walsh tried several times to make pastoral visits to the Harlow farm. Each time Thomas would meet him at the door and step outside to talk to him, instead of inviting him in. "Just wanted to check on how your family is doing, Mr. Harlow. We have not seen you at services for a few weeks." "We are doing fine, Reverend. The farm keeps us busy, of course. But you know the church community is here to help each other. If your family requires anything, we require nothing. Thank you. We are self-reliant." The talks always finished in the same manner, with Thomas politely but strongly dismissing the Reverend and shutting the door. Walsh later told the church leaders that he had never been let inside the Harlow house, even though he had tried at least a dozen times over the years. But there was one service that Walsh remembered clearly. It was Easter Sunday in 1868. The church was packed. Even people who didn't attend regularly made an effort to come for Easter. The Harlow family came and sat in their usual spot in the back. During the sermon, Walsh talked about resurrection and redemption, about the chance for salvation, even for those who had sinned greatly. It was a typical Easter message, one he had given many times. But as he talked, he saw Margaret Harlow start to cry, not just quiet tears. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking. Her daughter, Catherine, who was now 20, put an arm around her mother and whispered something urgent to her. Thomas sat perfectly still, staring at Walsh with an intensity that made the Reverend stumble over his words. There was something in that look, not anger, but something worse. Desperation, like a man who is drowning and knows no one can rescue him. The family left before the service was over. Walsh saw them walk quickly to their wagon and drive off at a speed that seemed almost frantic. He never saw Margaret Harlow at church again. For the next 7 years, until the family went missing, only Thomas and the children sometimes came to services. When people asked about his wife, Thomas would just say she was not feeling well and couldn't make the trip. The children, the Harlow children, Catherine, James, and Robert, were by all reports polite, well-educated, and very odd. Margaret taught them at home instead of sending them to the small school in Millbrook. This was not strange. Many farm families taught their children at home, but the Harlow children had almost no contact with other young people their age. Catherine, the oldest, was sometimes seen in town when she went with her father to the market. She was a quiet girl who became a quiet young woman, pretty in a plain way, with her mother's dark hair and her father's sharp face. She would stand by the wagon while Thomas did his business, her eyes always looking down, her hands folded in front of her. Louise Gardner, the store owner's daughter, once tried to become friends with Catherine at the market. Louise was the same age and wanted a female friend in a town with few young women. "Hello, you're Catherine Harlow, right? We're the same age. I thought maybe we could—" "I'm sorry," Catherine cut her off, her voice almost a whisper. "I can't. I'm not allowed to have friends." "Not allowed? But surely, please don't speak to me. You'll just make things harder." And Catherine had walked away, leaving Louise feeling confused and a bit sad in the middle of the market. But later that day, as Louise was helping her father close the store, she saw Catherine standing on the other side of the street, partly hidden by a corner of a building. The girl was looking at Louise with a look of such deep wanting and sadness that it made Louise's heart hurt. Then Thomas appeared, took Catherine by the arm, not roughly but strongly, and led her back to their wagon. Catherine went without resisting, her head down, looking like someone being taken to be executed. James and Robert were even more cut off from others. They were hardly ever seen in town. The few times they were seen with their father, they were quiet and observant, their eyes moving around as if everything they saw was strange and new. A traveling school teacher came to Millbrook in 1869 and said she would test any children whose parents wanted to see how well they were educated. Thomas brought James and Robert, who were then 18 and 14, to be tested. The teacher, a woman named Miss Constance Winters, later wrote about the meeting in her journal. The Harlow boys are incredibly well educated in school subjects. James showed he was skilled in math, literature, and even basic Latin. Robert, though younger, showed a similar ability. But there was something very unsettling about them. They answered questions like robots, as if they had been trained on the answers. They never started a conversation. When I asked them about their interests, their hobbies, what they liked to do, they looked at each other with confusion, as if the question did not make sense. James finally said, "We work, Miss Winters. We study and we work. That is what we do." I asked what kind of work they did on the farm. Robert started to reply, then stopped suddenly and looked at his brother. James said quickly, "Field work, looking after the animals, normal farm chores." But there was something in the way he said it that sounded practiced. And Robert had turned very pale, his eyes wide as if he had almost said something dangerous. I asked if they ever played games or went fishing in the creek, or did any of the things young men usually enjoy. They both stared at me with blank faces. "We don't have time for things like that," James finally said. "There is too much work to do, always too much work." Their father was waiting outside during the evaluation. When I came out to tell him my opinion, I mentioned that while his sons were advanced in their studies, they seemed to lack normal social skills. They needed more time with other young people, more time for fun. Mr. Harlow's jaw tightened. "They are being prepared for the real world, Miss Winters. The world is not a kind place. They need to learn about duty and discipline. I suggested that children also need happiness and friends." He just looked at me with cold eyes and said, "Those are luxuries we cannot afford." As they were leaving, young Robert turned to look at me again. His mouth opened as if he was about to say something, but James grabbed his arm and pulled him away. The last thing I saw was Thomas putting his hands on both of his son's shoulders, not in a loving way, but like a guard securing his prisoners and leading them to their wagon. I was very disturbed by the meeting, though I could not say exactly why. There was something terribly wrong in that family, something that was more than just being strict or socially awkward. Those children were living in a jail, I am sure of it, but the bars of their jail were invisible to everyone but them. Miss Winters left Millbrook the next week and never came back, but she kept that journal entry, and it would later be included in the official investigation file. The sounds at night. The Porter family, who lived closest to the Harlos, had an unspoken rule of not talking about what they heard at night, but Emma Porter kept a personal diary, and in it she wrote down things she observed that would later be very important for understanding the order of events. August 12, 1862. I heard singing again tonight from the Harlow property. It's beautiful in a way that makes me so sad. It sounds like the old spiritual songs that the enslaved people used to sing before the war, but I have not seen any black people working on Thomas's farm. Where is that singing coming from? October 3rd, 1864. The war is affecting everyone now. Men from Millbrook have been forced to join the army. We are all scared, but the Harlow farm remains oddly unaffected. Thomas did not get a conscription notice. I wonder why. Samuel says it's because he is over 40 and has 3 children to take care of, but I think there is another reason. I think the authorities know something about that farm, something that makes them want to avoid it. January 17, 1866. The war is finished and everything is different. The enslaved people are now free, legally free. But I heard crying coming from the Harlow property last night. A woman's voice was crying out words I could not quite understand. It sounded like she was begging. Samuel told me to shut the window and go to sleep. He said, "Some things are not our concern. But how can another person's suffering not be our concern?" March 22, 1868. I saw something tonight that I cannot explain. I was awake because of a toothache, looking out the window to take my mind off the pain. It was long after midnight and I saw lights moving around the Harlow property. Lantern lights, at least 3 or 4 of them. They were moving through the fields in a strange way, like people looking for something, or maybe burying something. The lights were there for more than an hour. In the morning, I looked over at their south field and saw that the earth had been recently dug up. Someone had been digging. June 8, 1870. The noises from the Harlow place are different now. Less singing, more, I don't know how to describe it. Moaning maybe, or a wailing sound like animals in pain. Margaret Harlow has not been to church in 2 years. The children look like they are haunted. Thomas looks like a man who knows a terrible secret. I don't know what is happening on that farm, but I know it is evil. I feel it in my bones. But what can I do? Who would believe me? And what proof do I have besides noises in the night and my own feelings? Emma's last note about the Harlows was written on September 25, 1875, just 10 days before the family went missing. Something is about to end. I can feel it. There is a different feeling in the air around the Harlow property, like the feeling before a storm. Thomas looks worse every time I see him. Thin, with dark circles under his eyes, and he jumps at any shadow. The children move as if they are sleepwalking through their days. And last night, I heard the most unsettling sound yet. It was not singing or crying. It was laughter. Cold, joyless laughter coming from somewhere under the ground, and then a voice. I could not tell if it was a man or a woman shouting words I could just barely hear. Soon. Soon, soon. God help us all. To know what took place in that basement, we first need to know who was living there. This has been the hardest part of the case to figure out, because Thomas Harlow and his helpers went to great lengths to make sure these 7 people would not have any official record. But by putting together pieces of documents, coded letters, purchase records, and later statements, we can put together at least some of their identities. Samuel, listed as age 27 in 1854, although his real age might have been different. A broken document found in the basement said that Samuel was born on a tobacco plantation in North Carolina. He had been working in the field since he was 7. A bill of sale described him as strong, healthy, able to read, and skilled in woodworking and taking care of animals. The fact that Samuel could read was important. It meant he had been taught to read, even though there were laws against educating enslaved people. This showed he was smart and determined, which Thomas Harlow must have seen as either a good thing or a threat. Samuel's handwriting was found on wooden beams in the basement, scratched in with what was probably a nail or a piece of metal, dates, names, and simple messages like, "Remember who you are and they cannot take your soul." Ruth, about 23 years old in 1854. Documents suggested she had been a servant in a house on a Virginia plantation, skilled in cooking, cleaning, and looking after children. One part of a bill of sale described her as calm, obedient, good for housework, in good health. But Ruth was not calm at all. According to Thomas's journals, she was the first to fight against his procedures, struggling so hard during the first examination that he had to hold her down. Her spirit, it appeared, was not easy to break, at least at first. Scratched on the wall near one of the sleeping areas was what looked like a poem in Ruth's handwriting, based on the style and words. "They can chain the body, but not the mind. They can take freedom, but not dignity. They can steal years, but not spirit. We are more than what they make us. We remain." Marcus, about 22 years old, was noted in incomplete records as a blacksmith's helper. He had been trained in working with metal, which meant he had valuable skills besides working in the fields. The bill of sale described him as intelligent, skilled in ironwork and metalwork, can read and write, needs to be handled strictly. That last part, needs to be handled strictly, was a code that meant Marcus had a history of resisting or trying to run away. He would not give in easily. Ironically, Marcus's metalworking skills might have been what made the final escape possible. Marks from tools found in the basement suggested that someone who knew about metal had changed the chains over time, making them weaker at important points in ways that would not be easy to see. Rebecca, 19 years old in 1854, was described in papers as coming from a breeding farm in southern Virginia, one of the most terrible places of the slavery system where women were made to have children to be sold. The fact that Rebecca was described as young, healthy, of childbearing age, good for domestic or field work, tells us everything about the horror of her early life. But Rebecca survived. More than just survived, she kept a part of herself that even Thomas Harlow's procedures could not completely erase. Her name was mentioned more than any other in his journals, usually with notes of frustration. Subject 4 continues to fight conditioning, and Subject 4 showing surprising memory retention. Joshua, also 19 years old in 1854, had been trained as a carpenter. The bill of sale described him as skilled in woodworking and construction, can read, good with numbers, suitable for skilled labor positions. Joshua's carpentry skills would be very important for the final escape. The tunnel that was found after the disappearance showed signs of a good understanding of structural engineering. The walls were properly supported with wooden beams, which stopped it from collapsing even as it went on for 30 feet through clay soil. Dina, 18 years old in 1854, was listed as a field worker from a rice plantation in South Carolina. She was described as strong, able to endure, experienced in farm work, able to work long hours in hard conditions. What the bill of sale did not say was that Dinah seemed to have medical knowledge, folk medicine that had been passed down for generations. Thomas's journals sometimes mentioned Subject 6 trying to make medicinal mixtures from plants she somehow got. How she got plants while being held underground was a mystery, but it showed she was resourceful and determined. Benjamin, 18 years old in 1854, was listed only as suitable for general labor. Unlike the others, there were no special skills mentioned for him in the sale documents. But that did not mean he had no abilities. It meant he had been careful to hide them from his enslavers. Benjamin seemed to be the one who wrote the most on the basement walls: poetry, prayers, calculations, calendars. He covered every free surface with writing, as if he was determined to leave a record that could not be erased. One message, written in neat, careful letters near the ceiling of the second room where it would be hard to see, said, "We were 7. We were human. We had names. Remember us. Samuel, Ruth, Marcus, Rebecca, Joshua, Dinah, Benjamin. We existed. We mattered. We will not be forgotten." These 7 people, taken from their already awful situations and sold to Thomas Harlow with the knowledge that they would completely vanish, were brought to the farmhouse on Kettle Road in the summer of 1855. They went into that basement as human beings with names, histories, skills, and dreams. Thomas Harlow planned to turn them into something else entirely. The medical journals discovered in the basement gave a detailed and very upsetting account of what Thomas Harlow did to the 7 people held there. These papers, which Sheriff Curtis later kept from the public, are one of the most horrifying parts of American medical history. Thomas Harlow had worked during the Mexican-American War as an assistant to an army doctor named Dr. Devon Barrett. During that time, he had seen many head injuries and their results. He had seen men get shot in the head and live, but with changed personalities. He had seen men with serious brain injuries who lost memories, had different behaviors, and even seemed to turn into different people. This experience gave him an idea that was both scientifically interesting and horribly wrong. If harm to certain parts of the brain could alter personality and behavior, could careful surgery create controlled changes? Could you, by precisely manipulating brain tissue, change a person's sense of self? In the 1840s and 1850s, this was not as strange as it might seem. The new field of neurology was just starting to map out how the brain works. The famous case of Phineas Gage, where an iron rod went through his skull and greatly changed his personality, had happened in 1848 and was a topic of much discussion in medical communities. Doctors were starting to see that different parts of the brain were in charge of different functions. But there was a huge ethical gap between seeing these effects in accident victims and purposefully causing them through experimental surgery. Thomas Harlow crossed that gap with no apparent second thought. His journal started in August 1855. August 18th, 1855. First examinations of all 7 subjects are done. They are in good physical shape overall, although they show signs of past poor nutrition and injuries that match their histories. I have told them that they will be part of medical procedures that could help many people in the future. They do not seem happy about it, but their cooperation is not needed for the progress of science. The basement laboratory is finished. I have all the tools I need, bought through DB in Baltimore, who can get things from medical suppliers who don't ask questions. I have enough chloroform and laudanum for several procedures. The surgery books give enough direction for the surgeries I plan to do. M is upset by the project. She understands why it is necessary on an intellectual level, but does not have the emotional distance needed for scientific work. The children are kept away from the basement and have been told never to talk about what they might hear. Catherine is old enough to ask questions, but she is an obedient child. She will keep secrets. Tomorrow I start with Subject 1, Samuel. He has the strongest personality of the group, which makes him the best choice for the first test. If the procedure is successful on him, it will be successful on anyone. August 22nd, 1855. First procedure is finished. Subject 1 was put to sleep with chloroform until he was completely unconscious. I made a cut at the bottom of the skull about 2 inches above the neck, 3 inches long. I pulled back the skin and muscle to show the skull. I used a trephine drill from a medical supplier in Baltimore to make a small hole in the skull, about 1 inch across, in the center at the base of the skull. I was extremely careful not to harm any major blood vessels. Through this hole, I put a thin silver wire about 2 inches into the brain tissue, aiming for what anatomy books say is the area for higher thinking and personality. The idea is that breaking the connections in this area will make the subject easier to influence and less able to make his own decisions. The wire is left in place, held with surgical thread to the nearby tissue. The hole in the skull is left open for now. I might need to access it again if the first results are not good. I stitched the skin and muscle closed over the area and applied bandages. The subject started to wake up about 6 hours after the procedure. The first signs are good. He seems confused and obedient. There is significant memory loss. He follows verbal orders without fighting back. August 25th, 1855. Subject 1 is showing troubling signs. He has trouble walking without help. His speech is slurred and confused. He seems to have lost the ability to eat by himself. This level of mental damage is more than I intended. I may have damaged more of the brain than I planned. The subject often asks, "Where am I and what happened?" But he does not seem to understand the answers even when they are said again. His eyes track movement, but he does not show any recognition or understanding. August 30th, 1855. Subject 1's state has not gotten better. If anything, it has gotten worse. He can no longer control his basic bodily needs. He does not know his own name. The other subjects are showing signs of great distress seeing his condition. This is a problem, but not a failure. Science moves forward by trying and making mistakes. I have learned that I put the wire in too deep. For the next subject, I will use a shallower insertion, aiming only for the frontal areas instead of the deeper parts. September 15th, 1855. Subject 1 died this morning. The body has been buried in the south field after dark as I planned. M refused to help with the burial even though I explained that Subject 1's sacrifice will help humanity in the end. She locked herself in our bedroom and did not talk to me for the rest of the day. I understand her upset comes from emotion, not logic. She cannot see the bigger purpose beyond the individual. This is a female weakness I must learn to accept. Subject 1's death, though sad, has given me valuable information. I now know the limits of what can be done in that specific brain area. The next procedure will be changed based on this. The journals went on like this for many pages. Thomas Harlow methodically performed procedures on each of the 7 captives, improving his method with each try. He kept detailed notes on the angles and depths of insertion and the locations. He wrote down recovery times, changes in behavior, and any problems. Ruth, Subject 2, survived her procedure but had severe mental damage. Thomas's notes said she returned to what he called a childlike state. She was unable to make new memories and had greatly reduced reasoning skills, but she was physically able to function and could follow simple orders. For 12 years, Ruth lived in the basement in this reduced state. Thomas's journals noted that she would sometimes sing songs she had known before the procedure, which suggested that her deeper memories were still there, even though her higher mental functions were gone. She died from pneumonia in 1867. Subject 2 worked well as a household helper in her limited ability, Thomas wrote. Her obedient nature after the procedure confirmed the main idea. Marcus, Subject 3, was considered a success story. Thomas's journal entries about him became almost excited. Subject 3 has recovered with very few noticeable problems. He can do complex jobs when told. He shows no aggressive behavior, no refusal of orders. Most impressively, he seems to have no memory of his life before the procedure. When asked, he cannot remember where he was born, if he has a family, or any details about his personal history. He lives in a constant present, doing the jobs I give him without question or complaint. This is the result I had theorized. This proves the concept. Marcus lived in the basement for 15 years, acting as what Thomas called an ideal subject. He died in his sleep in 1870 at about 38 years old. Thomas seemed genuinely sad about this. Subject 3's sudden death is a big problem. He had become reliably helpful. I will need to depend more on the remaining subjects. The others, Rebecca, Joshua, Dina, and Benjamin, had multiple procedures as Thomas tried to get the same results he had with Marcus, but he was never able to. Some had terrible problems and died within months. Others lived, but kept more mental function than he wanted, and most importantly, the 3 who lived the longest, Rebecca, Joshua, and Dinah, showed something Thomas had not expected: recovery. March 3, 1872. A troubling thing has happened with Subject 4, Rebecca. She has started asking questions about her past. Questions that show her memory is returning. This should not be happening. The damage to her nerves was supposed to be permanent. Yet she seems to be rebuilding memories, creating new nerve pathways around the damaged parts. The human brain is more adaptable than the medical books suggest. This is fascinating from a scientific view, but a problem from a practical one. July 19, 1873. Subjects 4, 5, and 6, Rebecca, Joshua, Dina, have clearly regained a lot of their mental abilities. They talk to each other when they think I am not around. They have started to refuse to do certain jobs, saying they are tired or sick. Subject 4, yesterday looked me in the eye and said, "I remember what you did to us." Her eyes were clear, focused, and full of what I can only call controlled anger. I am thinking about whether I need to do another procedure, but I am hesitant to risk more surgeries that might kill them. These 3 subjects are the result of years of work. November 2, 1874. The situation is becoming more and more difficult to handle. The remaining subjects have somehow gotten out of their restraints. I found the chains cut with what looks like a metal file. How they got such a tool is a mystery. They are still in the basement, but they are no longer really contained. They could break through the sealed door if they wanted to. I think they are planning something. Em is terrified. She wants me to let them go, but I cannot. They know too much. They would tell everyone everything. The children would be involved. Our family would be ruined. There is no solution that does not end in a disaster. April 17th, 1875. I found evidence today that the remaining subjects have been digging. There is a hole in the corner of the main room, hidden behind one of the sleeping pallets. It goes several feet into the ground. They are trying to dig a tunnel out. I should stop them, fill the hole, reinforce the basement, but I find that I don't have the will to do it. A part of me, a part I didn't know I still had, wants them to succeed, wants this nightmare to be over. 20 years is long enough. God forgive me. 20 years is much too long. The last entry about the procedures was written on September 28, 1875, the final entry in Thomas's journal. They are free in all the ways that count. The surgical procedures have reversed themselves through a process I do not understand. Rebecca, Joshua, and Dina are fully themselves again. Whoever they were before I destroyed them. They remember everything. Their lives before I purchased them. Their time in the basement. Every procedure, every shameful moment. Every moment of 20 years in darkness. And they are planning something. I can see it in their eyes when I take food down to them. They look at me like a hunter looks at its prey. They have stopped eating the food I give them. I think they are afraid of poison, although I have never thought of such a direct solution. They have been singing at night, old songs, spirituals about freedom and release and judgment. M begs me to go to the police, to confess, to stop this before something awful happens. But I cannot. Confessing would mean jail, execution, the ruin of my children's futures. Catherine, James, Robert. They would carry the shame of their father's crimes for the rest of their lives. There is no good option left. There are only different levels of disaster. I find myself thinking, maybe I deserve whatever they are planning. Maybe we all do. M for her silent participation, the children for their deliberate ignorance, and me for my monstrous curiosity. Maybe the only justice in this situation is the justice they will create. I hear them digging every night now. The tunnel is deep, long. Soon they will get to the surface, and then... The entry stopped there, in the middle of a sentence, as if Thomas had been interrupted or had just lost the will to keep writing. 7 days later, someone would put an anonymous note under the door of the Millbrook Methodist Church, warning that someone should check the Harlow basement before it was too late. And 5 days after that, Reverend Walsh would knock on the farmhouse door and get no reply. The official investigation into the disappearance of the Harlow family started on the evening of October 5, 1875, and would eventually include Sheriff William Curtis, 4 deputized men, Reverend Marcus Walsh, 2 church deacons, and later a special investigator from the Virginia State Attorney's Office. What they discovered would challenge their ideas about the human ability for both evil and survival. Evening of October 5, 1875. First findings. Sheriff Curtis got to the farmhouse just as the sun was going down, making long shadows across the tobacco fields. The house looked normal from the outside. It was well kept, quiet, and gave no sign of the terrible things it held. The front door was locked. The back door was also locked. All the windows on the ground floor were latched from the inside. It was Peter Griffith, the youngest deputy, who found that one window at the back of the house, a small window that opened into what looked like a pantry, was not latched. "Sheriff," Griffith called out, "I can get in this way." Curtis nodded. "Be careful. Call out if you see anything strange." Griffith climbed through the window, moving carefully in the growing dark. They heard him moving around inside, the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floors. Then there was silence. "Griffith," Curtis called, "what do you see?" No reply. "Griffith!" Finally, the deputy's voice came from inside, shaky and strange. "Sheriff, you need to come in here right now. You need to see this." They went in through the front door, which Griffith had unlatched from the inside. The house was dark. No lamps were lit, but there was enough twilight coming through the windows to see. Everything was perfectly neat. The furniture in the parlor was arranged nicely. The stairs going up to the second floor had no signs of any disturbance. In the bedrooms upstairs, the beds were made with great care. Clothes were folded and stored away. Personal things like hairbrushes, books, and a child's toy wooden horse were in their correct places. It looked like a house where the people had just gone out and would be back any minute. But in the kitchen, the feeling of normalness was broken. The table was set for 5 people, 5 plates, 5 cups, 5 sets of silverware, and on each plate was food, or what had been food several days ago. Roasted chicken that was now rotting, potatoes now covered in mold, bread that was hard and curled up, vegetables that were decaying into a bad-smelling mess. The flies had discovered the meal. They buzzed slowly in the dim light, fat and happy. They sat down to eat. Reverend Walsh said quietly, "And then what? They just got up from the table in the middle of their dinner?" But Sheriff Curtis was looking beyond the table, beyond the rotting food, to the far wall of the kitchen. The door was open. The heavy oak door that had been sealed with 8 wooden planks for 20 years was now standing open, showing only darkness. The boards that had sealed it were scattered on the floor, with nails still stuck in the wood. Some looked like they had been pried off. Others looked like they had been cut with a saw, and on the floor, in the area between the table and the open door, there were footprints. Multiple sets of footprints made in something dark that had dried to a rusty brown color. The prints were on top of each other and confusing, making a messy pattern. But the general direction was clear. Up from the basement, around the kitchen, and then back down into the basement. Curtis took a lantern from a hook on the wall, lit it with a match from his pocket, and went toward the open door. A steep set of stairs went down into the darkness. The smell coming from below was very strong. Damp earth, mold, human waste, and something else. A medical antiseptic smell mixed with decay. "Thomas Harlow!" Curtis called down the stairs. "This is Sheriff William Curtis. If you are down there, I need you to come up right now." His voice echoed in the space below. No answer came back. "Mr. Harlow, I am coming down. If you have a weapon, put it down. I don't want anyone to get hurt." Still no answer. Curtis started to go down, holding the lantern high. The wooden steps groaned under his weight. The walls on both sides were made of clay soil, supported by wooden beams. The construction was simple, but it worked. The work of someone who knew basic engineering but had done it himself without any professional help. The stairs went down about 12 feet and then opened into the first room. What Curtis saw at the bottom of those stairs made him freeze. It made him forget how to breathe for a moment. "My God," he whispered. Behind him, Peter Griffith had followed him, even though he hadn't been asked to. The young deputy looked over Curtis's shoulder and immediately threw up against the wall. The basement, if it could be called that, went far beyond the size of the house above. The first room was about 15 feet square with floors of packed earth and walls of exposed clay. Wooden beams, carefully placed and secured, held up the ceiling and kept it from collapsing. But it was what was in this space that made grown men shrink back. 7 sleeping pallets were arranged in 2 rows. Not beds. They were hardly more than heaps of straw covered with thin, stained blankets. Each pallet had a small wooden box next to it with a few things. A tin cup, a wooden spoon, a piece of cloth that might have once been clothing. The pallets clearly showed they had been used for a long time. The straw was flattened and old. The blankets were worn out in spots and had been fixed with rough stitches. One box had a comb made from bone, carved by hand, judging by the uneven teeth. But what made Curtis's blood turn cold was the sign of imprisonment. Iron rings were bolted into the support beams at regular spaces. 7 rings were placed exactly where someone lying on each pallet would be able to reach. Attached to some of these rings were pieces of chain that had been cut with what looked like a file or saw, but had clearly once been used to restrain whoever slept on the pallets. The third room was reached through a low opening at the back of the sleeping area. Curtis had to crouch to get in, and once inside, he could hardly stand up straight. The ceiling here was only about 6 feet high, and the space was narrow, going back into darkness beyond what his lantern could reach. This was a burial room. 7 holes had been dug in the floor, each about the size and shape of a human body. 4 of them had remains in different stages of decay. 3 were empty, but had been freshly dug with piles of dark earth next to them. On the wall next to each grave, someone had scratched a name and dates. Samuel, born unknown, died 1855, he resisted. Ruth, born unknown, died 1867. She never forgot who she was. Marcus, born unknown, died 1870. They broke him. We will not be broken. Benjamin, born unknown, died 1860. He was only 22 years old. And then 3 more markers with graves ready but empty. Rebecca, born unknown, will never die in darkness. Joshua, born unknown, will die free or not at all. Danina, born unknown, will see justice done. The 3 empty graves were dated October 1st, 1875, just 4 days before. They dug their own graves, Deputy Thompson said quietly, having joined Curtis and Griffith in the burial room. The 3 survivors, they prepared these graves and dated them, but then they didn't use them. Because they changed their minds, Curtis said slowly, as he began to understand. They decided not to die. They decided to do something else instead. Griffith pointed to the corner of the room. "Sheriff, look. There's something else here." A hole in the wall, about 3 feet across, partly hidden by loose earth and stones. Curtis brought his lantern close and looked into it. A tunnel, dug by hand, going back into the darkness and sloping upward. The walls had finger marks in the clay, carved out over what must have been months or years of hard work. "They dug an escape route," Curtis said. "The 3 survivors, they tunneled out." "But then where are they?" Griffith asked. "And where's the Harlow family?" Curtis did not answer right away. He was putting together a sequence of events based on the evidence in front of him. 3 survivors, Rebecca, Joshua, and Denina, had spent years recovering from Thomas's procedures, getting back their memories and their sense of self. They had removed their chains somehow, filing through the metal with tools they made themselves. They dug a tunnel to freedom, working in secret, probably at night when the family above was asleep, and finally they had finished their tunnel. Freedom was close. They could have escaped, disappeared into the night and never been found. But they hadn't. Instead, they dug 3 graves dated October 1st, planning to die, or maybe planning for others to die. And then sometime around October 1st or 2nd, based on the condition of the food in the kitchen, something had happened. Something that changed everyone's plans. "The footprints," Curtis said. 8 sets of prints in the kitchen, 3 coming up from here. The survivors. 5 going down. The Harlow family. The question is, did the family go willingly or were they forced? Over the next few days, Sheriff Curtis and a changing team of deputies and volunteers carried out a detailed investigation of the property. What they discovered painted an increasingly troubling picture. In Thomas's study on the 2nd floor, they found a locked drawer in his desk. Inside were documents that provided important background. Letters from DB in Baltimore talking about buying and moving merchandise in carefully coded words. The letters confirmed that Thomas had bought 7 enslaved people in 1854, with the clear understanding that they would be removed from all official records. Financial papers showed payments to different suppliers for medical tools, surgery books, and materials for building the basement. Thomas had spent a large amount of money over 20 years to keep his underground lab. A journal written by Margaret Harlow was hidden in a hatbox in her bedroom. Unlike Thomas's clinical scientific notebooks, Margaret's journal was a story of her mental breakdown. July 1855. Thomas has brought 7 people to the farm. He says they are part of an important medical study. He says they have agreed to be part of it, but I have heard them crying at night. I have heard them begging to be let go. Thomas says I do not understand why the work is necessary. He says I lack a scientific viewpoint, but I know what is wrong when I see it. God help me, I know what is wrong, and I am not doing anything to stop it. December 1857. One of them died today. Thomas buried the body in the south field after it got dark. He would not let me help. He would not let me see. He said it was better if I stayed away from the technical parts of the project. I am so tired. I am so tired of acting like this is normal. But what can I do? If I tell the police about Thomas, he will be arrested, maybe executed. Our children will be left without a father, with a bad reputation. We will lose everything. So I keep quiet, and my silence makes me a part of it. There is no redemption for me. I know this now. April 1863. The war has made everything worse. Thomas is scared someone will find the basement while he is away if he is drafted. He has taken steps to make sure the people down there cannot escape, even if the house is searched. He has added more chains and reinforced the door. The noises from downstairs are constant now, crying, singing, sometimes screaming. I have stopped going to church. I cannot stand to hear talks about mercy and salvation when I know what we are doing, when I know that I am letting it happen. October 1870. Marcus died last night. Thomas is very upset. Not because a person is dead, but because he has lost his successful subject. He keeps saying Marcus was proof that his ideas were right. I wanted to scream at him. Proof that you can break someone's mind through torture is not proof of scientific progress. It's proof that you are a monster. But I did not scream. I never scream. I just nodded and went on making dinner as if a man had not just died in our basement after 15 years of being imprisoned. February 1875. The last 3 are getting better. I don't know how, but they are becoming themselves again. I can hear them talking, real conversations, not the confused mumbling that Thomas's procedures caused. They remember who they were. They remember what was done to them. Thomas is scared, though he won't say it. He checks the basement locks many times each day. He has started to carry a pistol. He knows what is coming. We all know what is coming. And I find myself thinking, we deserve it. Whatever they do to us, we deserve it. The last entry in Margaret's journal was from September 30th, 1875. Catherine came to me today with the decision she has made. My daughter, my first child, who has lived her whole conscious life with this horror under her feet, has finally had enough. She is going to send a letter to the church, an anonymous letter, telling someone to look into the basement. I should stop her. I should protect my family. But I can't. I am finished. 20 years of being complicit have destroyed my soul. If Catherine wants to reveal the truth, I will not stop her. Maybe someone from outside needs to end this. Maybe that is the only way any of us, survivors and perpetrators, will ever find peace. I asked Catherine if she understood what would happen. She said, "Mama, I understand that some things are worse than consequences. Living with this knowledge is worse than any punishment the law could give us. She's 17 years old and she is wiser than I have ever been." This confirmed what Curtis had thought. Catherine Harlow had written the anonymous letter that brought Reverend Walsh to the farm. The oldest child, no longer able to stand her family's guilt, had asked for help from the outside. But by the time that help came, the situation had already come to its terrible end. A week into the investigation, Curtis decided to explore the tunnel. Peter Griffith offered to go, as he was the smallest of the men. They tied a rope around his waist for safety, and so they could pull him back if they needed to, and gave him a small lantern. Then he crawled into the small opening in the basement wall and started to move through the passage. Griffith later described the experience. "It was barely big enough for me to squeeze through, and I am not a big man. I had to drag myself forward with my elbows pushing the lantern in front of me. The walls were rough clay with marks from whoever had dug it, mostly finger marks. I kept thinking about how long this must have taken. Months, maybe years, digging through clay with just their hands and whatever simple tools they could make. The tunnel went up at about a 15-degree angle. Whoever dug it knew basic engineering. They kept the slope the same to avoid a collapse, and they had supported weak parts with pieces of wood, probably taken from the sleeping pallets. I crawled for what seemed like a very long time, but was probably about 15 minutes. The tunnel turned several times on purpose, I think, to get around things like tree roots, and then suddenly it opened up. I came out under a rotten tree stump about half a mile from the farmhouse, deep in the woods on the eastern edge of the property. I stood up, dusted myself off, and looked around. The opening was perfectly hidden. You would never find it unless you knew exactly where it was. And here is the strange part, Sheriff. The ground around the tunnel exit was completely untouched. The autumn leaves were thick, covering everything, and they had not been walked on recently. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had come through here. But someone had. 3 people had escaped through that tunnel. The question was when, and where did they go after that? Curtis brought a surveyor to look at the tunnel more closely. The surveyor confirmed that it was about 35 feet long from the basement to the woods, that it showed a good understanding of soil mechanics, and that it had taken a huge amount of work to make. Whoever dug this, the surveyor said, was incredibly determined and patient. You can't do work like this quickly. If you dig too fast, the tunnel will collapse. You have to go slowly, carefully, supporting each part before you move on. I would guess this took at least a year of steady work, maybe 2 years. Could 3 people do it? Curtis asked. 3 people working in shifts, taking turns digging while the others rested or watched? Yes, it's possible. They would have to be quiet. Any loud noise would alert people above, and they would have to get rid of the dug-up soil somehow, probably by spreading it around the basement floor in thin layers so it wouldn't be noticed. Curtis thought about this. For 1 or 2 years, the 3 survivors had been digging their way to freedom, carefully, quietly, keeping their secret, even as Thomas Harlow became more and more aware that they had gotten their mental abilities back. It was an amazing achievement of planning and endurance, but it did not answer the main question. Why did they dig a tunnel to freedom but not use it to escape? Why did the footprints in the kitchen show them coming up into the house? And most importantly, where were they now? Where was the Harlow family? The investigation grew to include talking to neighbors, store owners, church members, and anyone who had been in contact with the Harlow family over the last 20 years. Patricia Downing gave her statement by letter from Richmond, describing her 1858 visit and her sister's request to investigate if anything happened to the family. Samuel and Emma Porter were interviewed at length. Emma's diary entries were looked at and became part of the official record. William Gardner, the store owner, gave his sales records, showing the pattern of purchases that suggested Thomas was providing for more people than just his immediate family. Miss Constance Winters, the traveling teacher, was found and interviewed about her meeting with James and Robert Harrow in 1869. A clearer picture began to form. The Harlow family had been living with their awful secret for 20 years, isolated and becoming more and more unstable. Margaret was psychologically broken. Catherine felt overwhelming guilt. The younger boys, James and Robert, had grown up thinking the horror was normal but showed signs of deep psychological harm. And Thomas himself had changed from a confident scientific experimenter to a scared man who knew his control was slipping. The investigation also found one particularly upsetting fact. Thomas Harlow had never been qualified to do any medical procedures. His job during the Mexican-American War had been as a clerk and assistant, not as a doctor. He had no medical training, no surgical experience, and no credentials at all. Everything he had done in that basement, the procedures, the experiments, the operations, had been done by an amateur who had learned from books and by trial and error on human subjects who could not say no. The 4 people buried in that basement had not just been imprisoned. They had been tortured to death by a man pretending to be a doctor. On October 21st, Sheriff Curtis gathered everyone involved in the investigation, deputies, the Reverend, the state investigator, and several trusted community members, and explained his theory of what had happened. Based on the evidence, I believe the sequence of events was this. For 20 years, Thomas Harlow imprisoned 7 people in his basement and performed experimental medical procedures on them. 4 died because of these procedures. 3 survived: Rebecca, Joshua, and Denina. Over time, these 3 survivors regained the mental function that Thomas's surgeries had damaged. They remembered who they were and what had been done to them. About 2 years ago, they started digging a tunnel to escape. They finished that tunnel in late September 1875. Freedom was within reach, but they had a choice: escape and live as fugitives, always looking over their shoulders, knowing Thomas might reveal their existence and have them hunted down as escaped prisoners or worse, or stay and make sure Thomas could never hurt anyone again. They chose the second option. On September 30th or October 1st, Catherine Harlow, the oldest daughter, sent an anonymous letter to Reverend Walsh, begging someone to investigate the basement. She could no longer live with her family's complicity. On October 1st, the Harlow family sat down to dinner, knowing that Catherine's letter would soon bring the authorities to their door. They ate together one last time. After dinner, or maybe during it, the three survivors came out of the basement. They had taken off the board sealing the door from the inside, using tools Thomas had carelessly left in the basement. They confronted the family. I don't know exactly what was said, but based on the footprint evidence, I believe this. The three survivors gave the Harlows a choice. Come with us into the basement, face what you have created, or wait here for the authorities and explain everything. Thomas, Margaret, Catherine, James, and Robert chose to go down. Maybe they felt they had no other choice. Maybe they thought facing the survivors' justice was better than facing the law. Maybe they just gave up, tired after 20 years of living with horror. They went down into the basement. And then Curtis stopped. This was where the evidence ended and the speculation started. And then they went into the tunnel, all 8 people. But the tunnel was never meant as an escape route for 8. It was barely wide enough for one person at a time. Somewhere in that tunnel something happened. The survivors carried out their justice, and the Harlow family disappeared. The 3 survivors came out of the tunnel exit in the woods. They scattered. They vanished into the countryside, probably separating immediately. By the time we found the basement 5 days later, they could have been anywhere. There was a long silence after Curtis finished. Finally, the state investigator spoke. "Sheriff, with all due respect, you are suggesting that 3 former enslaved people somehow kidnapped an entire family and made them disappear without a trace. That seems impossible." Curtis replied, "I know, but I have looked at all the evidence. I have crawled through that tunnel myself, and I am telling you, 5 people went down, but they never came up. The tunnel doesn't go anywhere except that one exit in the woods. There are no other passages, no hidden rooms beyond what we have already found. The 3 survivors came out. The Harlow family did not. Those are the facts." "Then where are the bodies?" "I don't know," Curtis admitted. "But I have a theory about that too. When Peter Griffith crawled through the tunnel, he only went as far as the exit in the woods. But what if the tunnel doesn't actually end there? What if it continues, hidden somehow, going deeper into the earth? Why would they dig past the exit point? To create a burial place, a place where certain bodies could be hidden, where they would never be found, a place of final justice." Curtis could see the doubt on the faces around him. It did sound unlikely, but he had been in that basement. He had seen what Thomas Harlow had done, and he understood something that many of the others did not. When people are pushed too far, when they go through years of unimaginable horror, they become capable of extraordinary things, things that seem impossible to those who have not suffered as they have. 3 people who had survived 20 years of imprisonment and torture, who had dug a tunnel through solid earth with their bare hands, who had rebuilt their broken minds through sheer force of will. Those 3 people were capable of anything, including making an entire family disappear without a trace. On October 25th, the state investigator made a decision. The case would be sealed. "The implications of this case are too explosive," he explained to Sheriff Curtis. "If the full truth comes out that a Virginia landowner spent 20 years conducting medical experiments on enslaved people, even after emancipation, with his family's knowledge, it will ignite tensions that are barely under control as it is. The war has been over for only 10 years. The wounds are still fresh. This story could start violence across multiple counties." Curtis wanted to argue, wanted to insist that the truth mattered, that the 7 victims deserved to have their stories told, but he also understood the investigators' worry. Virginia in 1875 was a powder keg. The truth about the Harlow farm could indeed start fires that would be hard to put out. The official report would state only that the Harlow family had moved because of money problems. The 7 bodies found buried on the property would be described as unknown victims of wartime violence and reburied in unmarked graves in the Millbrook Cemetery. The basement would be filled with earth. The house would be taken for unpaid taxes and sold at auction. The truth would be buried as completely as the victims. But Curtis made sure that detailed records were kept, full documentation of everything found in the basement, complete transcripts of all interviews, copies of Thomas's journals and Margaret's diary. All of it was sealed in the county archives with a note saying it was not to be opened for 50 years. He did this because he believed that someday, when enough time had passed, people should know what happened. They should know the names: Samuel, Ruth, Marcus, Rebecca, Joshua, Dina, Benjamin. They should know they existed. They should know they suffered. They should know they survived, and they should know that in the end, they had the final say. The Harlow farmhouse was empty for 3 years after the disappearance. The county tried to sell it, but potential buyers kept changing their minds. Some said the price was too high. Others admitted they had heard unsettling rumors about the property's history. The few who did move in never stayed for long. In the spring of 1876, a family named Richardson bought the property at an auction. They were from Pennsylvania, did not know anything about the Harlow case, and only saw a chance to get good farmland for a low price. They stayed for exactly 23 days. Mrs. Richardson later told her sister, "We heard sounds every night, singing from somewhere under the house, and voices, multiple voices, talking in turns like they were having a conversation. My husband went down to the basement to check. He came back up as white as a ghost and did not speak for an hour. When he finally told me what he had found, we packed our things that same day. The basement was supposed to have been filled in with earth, according to the county records. But when my husband went down, he found that the earth had been moved, dug out, and there was a hole in the corner, a tunnel entrance that had been freshly dug from the inside out, as if something that had been buried was trying to get back up. We left that afternoon and never went back. Let someone else deal with whatever is living in that basement." 3 more families tried to live in the house between 1876 and 1878. None stayed longer than a few weeks. All of them reported similar things: sounds at night, disturbances in the basement, a constant feeling of wrongness that made it impossible to sleep. By 1879, the house was abandoned. No one would buy it for any price. Vandals broke windows and took whatever was left. The roof started to leak. In 1881, a fire with an unknown cause destroyed the inside. Only the frame was left, with blackened walls and a crumbling foundation. In 1894, a strong storm system passed through the area. High winds and flooding damaged buildings all over the county. The Harlow farmhouse, already weak from years of neglect, simply fell apart. The walls fell in, burying the basement entrance under tons of debris. The land went back to the state and was eventually made part of the Jefferson National Forest. Today, the place where the Harlow house once stood is deep in protected wilderness. Not many people ever go to the area. Those who do sometimes report a strange empty patch of ground where nothing grows, not even weeds. Forest rangers have noticed this strange thing. Soil tests show no contamination, no clear reason for the bareness. Trees surround the clearing but will not grow into it, as if they are respecting an invisible line, and rangers have reported something else. On quiet nights in early October, when the weather is calm and the forest is silent, you can sometimes hear singing coming from the clearing. Multiple voices singing together in old spirituals that have not been sung in more than 100 years. The rangers joke about it. They call it acoustic tricks and wind in the trees and wishful thinking from people who know the local stories. But they do not camp in that clearing. And they do not look into the sounds too closely because deep down they know what everyone who has spent time in that forest knows. Some ground is haunted, not by supernatural spirits but by memories, by suffering so great that it leaves marks on the earth itself, by the ghosts of justice that was delayed but not denied. 48 years after the Harlow family disappeared, the letter came to the Millbrook Methodist Church. It was addressed to whoever now serves as Reverend, was postmarked from Philadelphia, and was written in a shaky hand on cheap paper. Reverend Lucas Brennan, who had started the job only 2 years before and knew nothing of the church's history with the Harlow case, opened it with curiosity. By the third paragraph, he was reading with growing horror. The letter was signed only R, probably Rebecca, the youngest female survivor. It read in full, "To the Reverend, I am old now, 77 years old if my calculation of my birth date is right, though I can never be sure. My memory of my childhood is in pieces, partly from the passing of time and partly from what was done to me later. I am writing this because I want someone to know the truth before I die. Not for forgiveness. I stopped caring about things like that a long time ago, but for the record, so that someone somewhere knows what happened. My name is Rebecca. That is the name I was given as a child, though it might not be the name I was born with. Memory is a tricky thing when someone has deliberately tried to ruin it. In 1854, I was 19 years old. I was sold to a man who promised to make me and 6 others disappear, and he did. For 20 years, we disappeared from the world. I will not describe in detail what Thomas Harlow did to us in his basement. Some acts of horror lose their power if you say them out loud. They become almost manageable, just words. I want you to understand that what happened was beyond words, beyond normal human cruelty. He did not just imprison us, he tried to erase us from the inside out, to remake our minds through surgery and pain until we forgot we had ever been human. He succeeded with some. Samuel died quickly, his brain damaged beyond repair. Benjamin died of infection after his procedure. Ruth lived for 12 years but never truly became herself again. Marcus became exactly what Thomas wanted, compliant, empty, a shell. But 3 of us survived, Joshua, Dinah, and myself. And over time, years and years, we found our way back. The brain is more resilient than Thomas knew. It builds new paths around damaged ones. It rebuilds itself. Slowly, painfully, we remembered who we had been. And when we remembered, we knew we had to do something. We could not just escape. Thomas would have reported us as fugitives, as escaped prisoners, as property. We would have been hunted. We would never be free. So we planned something else. We dug a tunnel. For 2 years, we took turns digging, using sharpened spoons, broken pieces of wood, our own hands. We dug toward freedom. But we also dug toward justice. On October 1st, 1875, we finished our work. That evening, we took off the board that sealed the basement door. We had filed through our chains months before, so nothing was holding us back. We could have escaped at any time, but we waited. We waited until everything was ready. We went upstairs and confronted the family. Margaret was terrified, but not surprised. She had known this was coming. The children were confused, having grown up with our imprisonment as their normal. Thomas was resigned. 20 years of guilt had made him empty. He knew he deserved whatever we planned. We gave them a choice. Come with us into the basement and see what you have created. Face the place where 7 people lived and 4 died because of you. Or stay here and wait for the authorities, because someone has already reported you. Catherine, the daughter only 17, had sent a letter to your church warning that someone should look in the basement. She told us this herself, crying, begging us to let her family go, saying she had tried to expose the truth. We believed her, but belief does not erase 20 years. Sorrow does not bring back the dead. Good intentions do not undo evil. They came down with us, all 5 of them, into the basement where we had lived like animals, into the burial chamber where our friends lay in unmarked graves, into the tunnel we dug with our hands. The tunnel was only 3 feet wide, barely big enough for one person. We went first, crawling, pulling them along behind us. They came willingly, or maybe they were just too shocked to resist. But the tunnel did not end where the sheriff later thought it did. That opening in the woods was a decoy. We had created it to mislead anyone who might search. The real tunnel continued past that point, hidden by a carefully made false wall. It angled deeper into the earth, going down instead of up. We had spent 6 months digging that second section, making a chamber at the end of it, a chamber big enough for 5 people. That is where we left them, deep in the earth, in the darkness where we had lived for 20 years. We left them with 1 lantern and 2 days' worth of water. We told them the tunnel exit was behind them. They would have to crawl back the way they came to escape. But there was no exit. The false wall we had built was solid. They would never find it in the darkness, never realize the way they had come in was blocked from the inside. They would search and call for help, and eventually accept that no help was coming. They would live for maybe a week with the water we had left them, maybe longer, depending on how carefully they rationed it. And then they would die in the darkness, as Ruth had died, as Samuel had died, as Benjamin and Marcus and the others had died. In darkness, alone, forgotten by the world.